I've been working on this new AppSheet app that's basically an uptime monitor. And if you haven't used something like that in the past, what it is basically a service where you put in a bunch of URLs for websites or web services. It goes out and makes requests to them on a regular schedule and notifies you if there's a problem so that you can go and deal with it. I'm going to make that app available as a free download, so if you have any need for that kind of thing, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you get notified when I post that video. And as part of that, I had to create some reusable automation components. So I thought I'd create this video to talk a little bit more about those reusable automation components and how they work and how to actually create them. If you've done any kind of traditional programming or even creating macros and such in Excel, these reusable components are basically like functions in those other languages. You write the code once and then you can reuse it multiple times. But in this case, we use code in air quotes since we're talking about AppSheet, a no-code platform. A while back, Google did a pretty major redesign of the AppSheet editor interface, and as part of that, they hid a lot of the details as far as how you actually create these reusable components within your automations. And I feel like what they did was overall good. It did remove a lot of complexity related to automations and make things much more clear for people who are new to AppSheet and actually creating these automations. However, it did hide or at least make more difficult to find some of the aspects and some of the UI components specifically for designing this reusability. So in order to get a little better look at what's happening under the hood here as far as these automations and the way that they work, let's switch back to the legacy editor for a minute. And I can do that by just clicking this icon up here, and you see it switches back to this view and we see some old names for things and such. Now I'm currently in the automation menu here, and you see underneath automation we have bots, events, processes, and tasks. So those are basically in the new interface all the things that you see combined together into that single automation, but these are the actual components that go into building up one of those automations. And one of the really nice things that they have in this legacy editor, and it's in the documentation as well, is this diagram here that shows how those pieces actually work together. So to talk through them, let's start with the lowest level here, and that's the tasks. And basically tasks are the things like send an email, call a webhook, the things that you usually see in the right-hand panel when you're configuring an automation in the newer version of the UI. And those things, those tasks run in steps, and we basically can have multiple steps within a particular process, and that's the next level up here, in order to complete a full automation. So you could have something as far as those steps are, you have a first step that calls a webhook, and then you have another step after that that has a task that actually updates some kind of data in your app based on the result that came back from that webhook. So again, at the lowest level here, we have tasks and then steps that run those tasks, and then processes that actually group those different steps together to run them as a group. And then up to the left here, the next thing that we have is events. And these are basically the things that trigger your automation to run. So things like it could be run on a schedule, or it could be run on a piece of data being changed or a piece of data being added. Basically, this is the stuff that you configure up at the top of the automations in the newer interface. And then finally, all of this gets wrapped together into what's called a bot. And this is basically the equivalent of what you create when you go in the new interface and actually create an automation. It creates one of these bots, and that's kind of the wrapper or the container for everything within that particular automation. Now let's go back over to the new interface and see what all that stuff looks like there, and then we'll look at how we can actually make pieces of that reusable. All right, so we're back in the new editor interface here, and let's go through each one of those things that we just talked about in that diagram. So at the top, the first thing we have is events. This is what triggers the automation to actually run, and I have a scheduled event set up here, so this actually runs on a schedule, but it can be a data change or anything like that. So that's the first part. The next thing we have is the processes, which again is the grouping of steps. And these are the steps below with tasks within each one of them. So if I click on one of these, the step is what actually appears in this menu here. Run a task, run a data action, wait, branch a condition, all those things. And then underneath that are the tasks that we actually have configured. So I have a run a task here, which is running this task called call a script. And for the next one is another step. It's a branch on condition step. And I have on at least the no condition to run a task, which is to send an email. And so that's basically that exact structure that we just looked at represented in the new UI. And again, you can see how setting things up like this is a little bit simpler for a new user because you don't really have to think about those different concepts, but that does actually describe how those concepts in the old UI actually relate to what we have here in the new UI. And when we go back to thinking about reusing these things, we want to remember those concepts of those different entities like events, like steps and processes and such, because that's the level that you can actually reuse these things at within AppSheet. So for this particular app, the reason that I was using the reuse was because I have this one process here for actually running the check on a website. So what it does is first it runs the check based on what we have is configured in the app as far as the actual data for these websites. It pulls in that data, it calls out to that website, and then runs a check to see if certain patterns are present in the content that gets returned and things like that. So I wanted to, this is a multi-step process to run the check, determine if the check was successful, send an email if it's not, and then in newer versions, I'm also kind of logging that and cleaning it up as well. So this entire process, I wouldn't want to, I have different times to set up as far as like when this runs on different schedules, and if you click a button, it runs in order to be able to test it. And I don't want to have to define this process over and over and over again, because it would be a big pain if you had to create all of these steps and all these tasks over and over again. And you can duplicate them, but then you have multiple copies of the same thing, and if you change one in one place, it doesn't change it in others. So the way that you actually mark these things as being reusable is using this little link box that they have right here. And I've already linked this process to multiple places, so it's not letting me uncheck it here. So let's just create a new automation to see exactly what this looks like. So I'm going to configure an event. And you see this particular event is just, something being added, deleted, or updated from the emails table. And if I want to make that task reusable, I can just click up here and I can say linking on in order to turn that on. So that thing is now, even though we're only using it in this one place, this event is now can be shared in multiple places. And if I did share it somewhere else, I'd be able to update the details in any of those places to be able to actually change it. And once you turn linking on, you'll see that underneath the bots menu here, we also have sub-menus that actually show the different things that are shared. So if I go to events, I see that event that we just said is linked, and I can make changes to it here as well. I can also go to processes, and that you see the one process that we were just looking at, my automation is outlined here, and this is the actual shared process that I can go and use in multiple places as well. And the same thing will appear down here for tasks. If you create tasks and mark them as shared, again, using that same little link checkbox, you'll see a new tasks menu show up under here, and you'll be able to manage your tasks there as well. All right, now let's take a look at how to actually use these reusable components once we've created them. So I'm going to go back to bots here. I'm going to create a new bot. And you see currently I have one here that's running on the hour, that's running the process that we talked about earlier. So it's a scheduled task that runs at the top of every hour and runs that process. I want to create another one that runs at 15 minutes after the hour and runs the process. So that's what I'm going to do down here. I'm going to say configure event. I'm going to create a new event. I'm going to make it scheduled and say to run 15 minutes after the hour. And I'm going to have it run on each row on the table. So basically it goes through all my endpoints and runs the same process for each one of them. Now, In order to reuse that whole component that we looked at earlier that's actually calling out to the website and everything, I can just select under my processes menu here and just select endpoint check, and you see that it just fills in everything there. So that's basically that linked process. And if I change anything here now, I'm changing the actual shared process and not the one specifically in this bot. So that's something to keep in mind as well, that this is basically equivalent to when you go into this menu and edit things if you're actually editing them in one of the bots that they actually reside in. You're editing the shared copy of that particular process. All right, so that's basically how these shared components work, but there are 3 other things that I want to specifically call out before we wrap up. The first is to just show how you can actually use the shared events and shared tasks. So to do shared events, I just hit configure event, and you see it says from this app shared event, which is another shared event that I had created, and I can just select it and it will copy. So again, that's using, you can see up here that it's got the little link indicating it's using a shared copy of an event. In order to do the same thing and use a shared copy of a task, I can add a new step. I can say create step, and I'm running a task, and then down here in the menu, you see it says shared task. So I can select that shared task and actually run it from that point, and it's again got the link up in here to indicate that it's using the shared task. All right, so that's number 1 thing that I wanted to call out. The second is that all of these things are still very tied to tables within AppSheet. So basically, if you're using a shared event that is based on a particular table, in this case endpoint, you need to also be using a shared task that's linked to that same table, or it won't work. It won't show up. So to show an example of that, if I just delete this and I add in and let's go out of here and delete this for a second as well. And if I add in another event that's just based off of the emails table and hit add step and create new step and run a task, you see that there's no option to run my shared task here. And that's because my shared task is based on the endpoints table, and this event now is based on the emails table. And if I go back into my actual task there, you see this is where that's defined. Each one of these things has a table linked to it. So this is shared task that's linked to that. If I go to my events, my shared event is linked to endpoints, and my shared processes is also linked to endpoints. So again, you'll only ever be able to call shared task that's associated with the table that's in the context that you're dealing with in that particular automation. And then the third thing that I want to call out is how you can actually change the context that it's being called in by calling a process within a process. So let's go back up to the bot again. Let's delete these things out again. I can probably keep this because I already have this in the emails table. So I'm currently running in the context of the emails. But what I can do is add another step. And in this case, I want to make this step called call a process. So if I want to be able to call my shared process, which is in the context of endpoints, even though I'm currently running within the context of the email table, I can call a shared process. I can call my endpoint check. And what I need to do now is actually give it a record that is in the endpoints context. And I can do that by either adding in a new record, creating a record, in which case I need to provide all the data that's required in order to create that record. Or I can select lookup and basically pass in an ID for a particular record that already exists in order to be able to run this process on that record. So by calling a process within a process like this, you're able to get around that restriction that you're only able to call something that's in the same table context that you're currently working within. All right, kind of a lot there and not really the easiest thing to figure out, at least it wasn't for me. But once you do connect all the dots there, it's pretty powerful. If you end up in a spot that you have to create some reusable components yourself, I hope this was helpful in figuring out how it all works. And if you have any questions about it, ask down in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. That's all I got for today. Thanks for watching and happy building.